realistically, the extent to which we're going to get the government's attention, even if they wanted to legislate and even if we wanted them to, we need to be real that we're competing with some very, very other big real world and social geopolitical issues. So the truth is, our view from a federation point of view is, the better organised we can be, the more we can do together voluntarily, by agreement, by as much consensus as possible. I also think, Tom, and we need to be alive to political reality. I mean, for us, this is incredibly important stuff, isn't it, fire? And in one respect, the industry is worth a few £billions a year, so it's a big issue. But relatively speaking, there's about between 300 and 400 people a year die in fire, and that's a tragedy. But to put it in some kind of context, your average district general hospital, there'll be more people dying a year in an average-sized one district general hospital than there are perishing fires in 1 year. So, and thankfully that's the case. But against the government's challenge, Tom mentioned climate change, the economic situation, we've got the war in Ukraine, there's a cost of living crisis, climate change, wildfire, but not just wildfires, the temperature, what all that means, the rise of Russia, what the hell's going to happen with AI coming forward, and the small matter of a general election. So the government's got a big paper round, it's fair to say. And so realistically, the extent to which we're going to get the government's attention, even if they wanted to legislate and even if we wanted them to, we need to be real that we're competing with some very, very other big real world and social geopolitical issues. So the truth is, our view from a federation point of view is, the better organised we can be, the more we can do together voluntarily, by agreement, by as much consensus as possible, but not necessarily waiting for absolute consensus, then the better off we'll be, rather than waiting for government. And that's not because governments can't be bothered, it's because we're in competition with so many other huge priorities.
Okay, great. I've got that, and I think when I was involved in the discussion with one government department, I think he referenced the leader of the director of that department referenced using us as a sounding board. That's a quotation, and that to me has stuck with me, to think they're not going to say you do this or you do that, and we shouldn't expect them to. They might throw a proposal to us that we take, mull over, and then bounce back to them. And I think if I use that in my head as the way of thinking how government will work with us, it certainly helps in my case to imagine how it will work.
I think that's exactly right. If we're going to take a leadership role and sort of take this forward, try and form this strategic view, push this strategic view, we can't think of it as waiting for somebody else to tell us what to do. We're going to have to sort of like get on with it, start thinking about some of these issues, start, as Steve has suggested, produce some papers, produce some thought leadership work, go and test that with various different stakeholders across the sector and with government, and see where that leads us. Now, Steve makes a fantastic point, is there's competition for attention whichever way you look at it. But our key point here is, actually, if somebody's not thinking about fire safety, that's a bad place to be. And that's where I think this adds real value, is there needs to be somebody who's thinking about some of these issues and raising them up. And that's where I think this whole issue of a national strategic view that's sort of cutting across all the issues and ensuring that they're discussed, they're looked at, there's a view formed, there's a bit of horizon scanning to sort of see, well, what's coming towards us. I think that positions us into a much better place than we are currently. The challenge is, how do we make that work? And that's what we're working through right now, is to sort of build that vision of the world.
Just add to a really interesting point from that, Tom, there, about... so I was slightly flippant and said, rather than saying you don't need to think about us all the time, but my advice is don't forget about us, because it's the moment you forget about us that you've got a problem. Just in the papers today, which I suppose dates the date that we're doing this on, there's an 11th hour problem with the opening of this kind of seaborne vessel to house migrants, which, people will have their own views, right or wrong, about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But essentially it's all come to a grinding halt because of the local fire authority won't sign off or won't agree that it's a safe place for people to be housed on because of a fire safety policy. and the government, this has been a flagship policy of the government for some time, and you would have thought that it wouldn't take an 11th hour, hiccup to grind it to a halt, because at an earlier stage it would have been really useful if somebody had thought about the fire safety or the fire risk assessment implications of putting a lot of people on effectively a seagoing vessel out at sea with not that many ways of getting off, especially if you can't swim. So the point being that the policy wasn't about fire. The policy was about something very different and nothing to do with fire. But it's the fire issue that potentially grinds it to a halt or a stop. And so part of our proposition to government is we don't expect you to think about fire all the time, because it may well not be your core purpose or your raison d'etre. But if you forget about it all the time, it will come back and create a problem as well as creating a tragedy.
I remember when that was first mooted and on LinkedIn, and I did put a comment under the government post saying, hopefully you've thought about fire safety in this, because it did look a bit risky to me. I have to say, but maybe not. But that's a great illustration, Steve, of the whole political landscape and why that takes a priority over, and fire comes way down the pecking order, so to speak. And yet it's obviously very, very important. We spoke about, or Tom, you touched on the challenges. I'm gonna ask Steve for 3 key obstacles that you're now working to overcome to get this up and running, and so it's a reality and a functioning organisation in the way that you've described it in the last half hour.
Okay, so first I think one is time. This thing, it will take time, and it takes time to bring consensus and agreement, and we're competing for time against a whole range of other commercial drivers for some of the organisations, political drivers and legal drivers for other departments. So an acceptance that it's going to take time is kind of one of the barriers. Second one is this pathological pursuit almost for the word consensus. The idea that we can get everybody together and agree and just keep going, and eventually we'll get everybody to agree. I think one of the things that we just need to accept from the outset is that we can get as much agreement as possible, but if our goal is to get absolute agreement, where we'll end up with these positions that are so neutral and vanilla as to almost not be worth having in the first instance. So I think we just need to get a maturity amongst organisations that are involved with us to accept that it's going to be one voice-ish, but probably variations of the same voice, and as close to consensus as possible, but more experts' agreement or broad agreement. And I think the third thing is one of capacity. I think it'll take us time to build the structure that we've got in mind and resources to do that. I don't think those are unachievable, and I think we've got some good plans in place. But I mean, in the end, everything takes some capacity to deliver, and this is no different to that. So it will be an issue for us down the line. But I actually wouldn't put it up at the top of our priorities, because I think we're doing reasonably well with the capacity that we've got. We'll just need to grow more of it as the Federation grows and develops. Those will be my 3.
Okay, Tom, do you want to add any to Steve's top 3?
Only that actually what I've noticed as we've gone through this is still evolving. This is not like a fixed thing that I think is going to be perfect. And if we waited for that, we're talking about something that's going to start in about a decade. And for me, it's more a case of we've got to get to a point where it's good enough to start. And that's our challenge, is getting enough people on board to sort of get to that point where it's good enough to start this thing and start the progress. And that's not so much a challenge, it's more that challenge of, accepting the fact that it's not going to be perfect. It's going to continue to evolve. And in a world of, and you said it, I'm an engineer, I'm used to this, trying to get it just right, as Steve has often mentioned to me. Actually, we've got to stop and say, no, we have to get on and bring this together. We've got enough of an idea. We're working through that process right now of bringing enough people on board so that we can actually get this thing to start. Yeah. And I think that's the key element here. But for everybody listening to this is, don't think that this is not going to evolve over time, because as we progress this, I think people will have better ideas, some different ideas, and we'll have to adapt. to find a solution that really works and brings this together in the way that we can see it can have a real impact on fire safety across our nation.
Okay.
Is that lovely expression, isn't it, Chris? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I think that applies here. You know, we can get on with things. It might not be perfect, but it's going to be a lot better than where we are now.